Welcome, Whispering Bee family. Today's story begins with a marriage that looked unshakable, 12 years of trust, love, and a future carefully built together. But all it took was one small mistake to unravel everything, revealing a truth far more calculated than betrayal. Her husband wasn't just planning to leave, he was planning to erase her. What he didn't see coming was this: Judith was never the kind of woman to be quietly discarded. Behind her calm was a mind sharp enough to trace every hidden move, every missing dollar, every secret account. Stay with us to discover how Judith refused to become a victim, and instead rewrote her story as a woman who fought back, and won. Judith Gilliard had always believed that love was supposed to feel like coming home. For 12 years, that's exactly what her marriage to Darren had been. A warm refuge from the chaos of the world. A partnership built on trust, shared dreams, and the kind of intimacy that made other couples envious at dinner parties. They were the couple people pointed to as proof that lasting love existed, that soulmates were real, that happily ever after wasn't just something that happened in fairy tales. But on a cold Tuesday morning in November, while the coffee maker sputtered to life and frost painted delicate patterns on the kitchen window, Judith would discover that the man she'd built her entire adult life with had been systematically dismantling it, piece by calculated piece. It started with a text message that wasn't meant for her eyes. Judith had grabbed Darren's phone by mistake that morning. They had matching cases, a small detail from their anniversary trip to Japan 3 years ago. She remembered buying them at a tiny shop in Kyoto, laughing as they tried to explain what they wanted to the elderly shopkeeper who spoke no English. They'd walked out holding hands, phones protected in matching black leather cases with cherry blossom details embossed on the back. It had seemed romantic then, a symbol of how intertwined their lives had become. A visual representation of their unity. Now that same detail would be the crack that exposed everything. She'd reached for what she thought was her device on the charging station, squinting against the early light filtering through the kitchen windows, when the screen illuminated with a preview notification. Her thumb hovered over the home button as her brain processed the words that would shatter everything she knew. The message read, "Transfer confirmed. Cayman account active. See you tonight, beautiful." The sender was listed simply as June, with a heart emoji. Judith's hands went numb. The phone nearly slipped from her grip, and she had to steady herself against the granite counter they'd chosen together 3 years ago during the kitchen renovation. Her breath caught in her throat. Her vision tunneled. For a moment, she stood frozen in her kitchen, the space where she'd made thousands of breakfasts, celebrated countless small victories, and kissed her husband goodbye every morning for over a decade. This was where they'd decided to buy the house, sitting at the small breakfast nook with spreadsheets and mortgage calculators spread across the table. This was where Darren had told her he'd gotten his promotion, spinning her around in celebration while she laughed and told him to put her down. This was where they'd held each other after her mother's funeral, where he'd whispered that they'd get through it together, that she wasn't alone. The familiar suddenly felt foreign, like she'd stepped into a stranger's life wearing her own skin. She heard Darren's footsteps on the stairs, that familiar rhythm she could recognize anywhere. 3 steps down, pause at the landing where he always stopped to look at the gallery wall of their photos, 5 more to the bottom. It was a sound she'd heard nearly every morning for 12 years. A sound that had always meant safety, companionship, home. Now it filled her with dread. Without thinking, moving on pure instinct, she set his phone down exactly where it had been, picked up her own, and poured coffee with hands that trembled so violently she nearly dropped the mug. The dark liquid sloshed dangerously close to the rim, and she watched a drop fall onto the white countertop, spreading into a small stain that looked like blood. When Darren entered the kitchen, freshly showered and smiling that easy smile she'd fallen in love with in graduate school, Judith managed to return it. Her face felt like a mask, stiff and foreign, but somehow she pulled it off. Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it, certain he could see the panic in her eyes, the way her hands shook as she handed him his coffee. But Darren just kissed her cheek, grabbed his phone without looking at it, and started talking about his day ahead. A meeting with potential clients, lunch with his team, nothing unusual, Nothing that suggested he was hiding offshore accounts or planning to disappear with someone named June. Judith nodded in the right places, made appropriate sounds of interest, and felt like she was watching herself from outside her own body. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of mistake, some misunderstanding that would make sense once she had more information. But deep down, in the part of herself that dealt in facts and evidence and cold, hard numbers, she knew. She knew this was real. She knew her marriage was built on lies. She knew everything was about to change. She'd learned something crucial in that split second of terror. She couldn't let him know that she knew. Not yet. Not until she understood the full extent of what was happening. Because Judith Gilliard wasn't just a devoted wife. She was a forensic accountant. The irony wasn't lost on her as she sat at her desk later that morning, surrounded by financial statements for a corporate fraud case she was investigating. Her entire career had been built on following money trails, uncovering deception, and finding what people desperately wanted to stay hidden. She'd helped prosecute embezzlers who'd stolen millions from their companies. She'd exposed Ponzi schemes that had ruined hundreds of lives. She'd testified in cases involving complex financial fraud that most people couldn't begin to understand. For 15 years, she'd been one of the best in her field. Companies hired her specifically because she could find money that didn't want to be found. She could spot patterns in chaos. She could follow breadcrumbs through the most elaborate financial mazes and come out the other side with evidence that held up in court. But she'd never imagined she'd need to use those skills on her own husband. Judith pulled up their joint bank accounts first, her fingers moving automatically across the keyboard while her mind raced. Everything looked normal at first glance. The checking account showed regular deposits from both their salaries. Darren's consultant income deposited bi-weekly. Her own salary from the firm coming in like clockwork. Withdrawals for mortgage, utilities, groceries, the normal expenses of a comfortable middle-class life. Their savings account had a healthy balance, $230,000, the number that represented years of careful planning, disciplined saving, sacrifices made for the future they'd dreamed about together. A house in the country someday, with a big yard and maybe a garden. Maybe children, though they'd agreed to wait until their careers were more established. Early retirement to travel the world, to see all the places they'd pinned on the map in Darren's office. But Judith had been trained to look deeper than first glances. She began with the statements from 6 months ago, methodically working her way forward. That's when she noticed them. Small transfers that didn't quite fit the pattern of their normal financial behavior. Money moving in ways that seemed innocuous on their own, but formed a pattern when viewed together. Never more than $9,000 at a time. Just under the $10,000 threshold that would trigger automatic reporting to financial authorities under the Bank Secrecy Act. The amounts varied, seemingly random at first. $7,000, $8,500, $9,200. But they followed a pattern once she started tracking them. Every 2 to 3 weeks, money would move from their savings to checking, and then, within 48 hours, an equivalent amount would be withdrawn as cash. Structured transactions. Classic money laundering technique. Something she'd seen hundreds of times in her professional work, something she'd testified about in court, something she could identify in her sleep. Seeing it in her own accounts made her feel physically sick. Judith's chest tightened. Her breath came short. She had to consciously force herself to breathe slowly, to stay calm, to keep thinking clearly. Over 6 months, Darren had moved nearly $80,000 out of their accounts. $80,000. Money she'd helped earn, money they'd saved together, money she'd assumed was building their future. Where had it gone? Why hadn't she noticed? How had she been so blind? The questions hammered at her, but she pushed them aside. Self-recrimination could wait. Right now, she needed information. She needed to understand the full scope of what was happening before she could decide what to do about it. Her mind raced through possibilities, each one more devastating than the last. But she forced herself to stay calm, to think like the forensic accountant she was, not the betrayed wife she was becoming. Emotion was the enemy of clear thinking. She'd told clients that 1,000 times. Now she needed to take her own advice. She created a new folder on her encrypted hard drive and labeled it Project Household Review. Professional, detached, a name that wouldn't raise questions if someone happened to see it on her desktop. Then she began downloading every financial document she could access. Bank statements going back 5 years, credit card bills, investment accounts, tax returns, mortgage documents, everything. She worked through lunch, barely tasting the salad she'd packed that morning in the kitchen where her world had started to crack apart. Her colleagues came by her office to chat, to invite her to grab coffee, but she declined with distracted smiles and vague excuses about deadlines. They didn't press. Judith was known for her focus when she was working on a case. No one suspected that this time, the case was her own life. By 3 in the afternoon, she'd found the first hidden credit card. It was issued in Darren's name only, linked to an address she didn't recognize. A post office box in the next county, in a town they'd never lived in, never even visited as far as she could remember. The billing statements were being sent there, which explained why she'd never seen them. The account had been opened 8 months ago, right around the time the structured withdrawals had started. The statements showed charges that made Judith's stomach turn. Expensive dinners at restaurants they'd never been to together. Places she'd mentioned wanting to try, places Darren had always said were too pricey or too pretentious. But apparently they weren't too expensive when he was taking someone else. Hotel rooms, not just any hotels. 5-star properties in the city, the kind of places they'd stayed for their anniversary or special occasions. The Meridian, the Crown Plaza, the Essex House. She recognized the names, remembered happy memories in some of those rooms, and felt those memories curdle and rot. Jewelry purchases from boutiques she'd never heard of. High-end stores that sold the kind of pieces she'd admired in windows, but never seriously considered buying. Thousands of dollars on earrings, necklaces, bracelets, for someone who wasn't her. Flowers delivered weekly to an address in the city, a luxury apartment building where the cheapest units started at $4,000 a month. She pulled up the building website and felt her stomach drop. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble countertops, concierge service, a rooftop pool with views of the skyline. The name on the delivery receipts was June Morrison. Judith pulled up her browser and searched the name with shaking hands. LinkedIn profile appeared first. June Morrison, investment consultant, 32 years old. 7 years younger than Darren, 3 years younger than Judith. The profile picture showed someone attractive in that polished, professional way that made them look like they'd stepped out of a corporate magazine spread. Gender-neutral appearance, sharp suit, expensive haircut. Eyes that seemed to assess value with a single glance. She clicked through to June's company website. Morrison Financial Consulting specialized in offshore asset management, tax optimization strategies, and what they euphemistically called privacy-focused wealth preservation. The kind of firm that catered to people who wanted to move money without leaving obvious trails. People who had something to hide. The pieces were coming together like a puzzle she didn't want to solve, and the picture they formed made Judith feel physically ill. Darren wasn't just having an affair. That would have been devastating enough, but this was so much worse. He was strategically dismantling their financial life with the help of someone who knew exactly how to hide assets. This wasn't a crime of passion, some impulsive mistake driven by temporary attraction or midlife crisis. This was premeditated theft, executed with precision and professional guidance. Judith closed her office door and locked it. She allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to cry. She set a timer on her phone, pressed her face into her hands, and let the grief pour out in silent, shaking sobs. Her shoulders trembled. Her breath came in gasps. Tears soaked through her fingers and dripped onto her desk. When the alarm chimed, she wiped her eyes, reapplied her makeup with the emergency kit she kept in her drawer, and got back to work. Grief was a luxury she'd indulge later. Right now, she needed to be smarter than Darren and his accomplice combined. She needed to understand every detail of what they'd done so she could figure out how to stop them. That evening, Judith came home to find Darren cooking dinner. The domestic scene would have been touching if she didn't know what she knew. He was making her favorite, Thai basil chicken, and had opened a bottle of the wine they saved for special occasions. a Pinot Noir from a small vineyard in Oregon that they'd visited 2 years ago. She'd bought a case, planning to save it for moments worth celebrating. Apparently, Darren had decided this qualified. He kissed her cheek when she walked in, leaving his hands on her waist a moment longer than usual. He asked about her day with what seemed like genuine interest. He'd set the table with their good dishes, lit candles, put on the jazz music she liked. He seemed so genuinely happy to see her that Judith almost doubted what she'd discovered. Almost. But she'd seen the evidence. Numbers didn't lie, even when the people behind them did. She matched his energy perfectly, smiled and laughed at his stories from work, complimented the food, telling him it was even better than the last time he'd made it. Suggested they watch the new documentary series they'd been meaning to start, the one about art heists that had been on their list for weeks. She played the role of unsuspecting wife so convincingly that she almost convinced herself. It was terrifying how easy it was to pretend, how naturally the performance came. She could laugh at his jokes while her heart was breaking. She could look into his eyes and see a stranger. She could accept his kiss goodnight while knowing those same lips had kissed someone else, had whispered sweet promises to someone else, had lied to her face for months. Maybe Darren had been pretending just as easily for months. Maybe this whole time, every smile and touch and declaration of love had been a performance. Maybe she'd never really known him at all. After Darren fell asleep that night, Judith slipped out of bed as quietly as possible. She waited until his breathing was deep and even, that particular rhythm that meant he was fully asleep. Then she carefully lifted the covers, placed her feet silently on the floor, and padded across the carpet to his home office. She'd never snooped before, had never had a reason to doubt or question. Their marriage had been built on trust, or so she'd believed. They'd always had access to each other's phones, emails, bank accounts. Complete transparency. Or at least, she'd thought it was complete. Now she understood that trust had been a one-way street. She'd been transparent while Darren had been building walls. Darren's laptop sat on his desk, closed but not locked away. Why would it be? He thought she trusted him completely. He thought she'd never look. Judith opened it carefully, the small click of the lid sounding impossibly loud in the quiet house. She held her breath, listening for any sound from upstairs. Nothing. She let out a shaky breath and turned her attention to the login screen. She was grateful that she'd watched him enter his password countless times over the years. His birthday backwards, combined with the year they'd met. She'd teased him about how predictable it was, had suggested he use something more secure. He'd laughed and said who would ever need to access his computer without his permission. They trusted each other. Now she was grateful for that predictability. The computer opened to his email. Judith created a new folder in her phone's notes app and began documenting everything. Screenshots of every relevant email, copied text of important messages. She set up an encrypted email account on the spot and forwarded the most damning evidence to herself. She found email chains with June that went back 8 months. She'd been right about the timeline. The hidden credit card, the structured withdrawals, the offshore accounts. It had all started around the same time. The early messages were professional. June had sent Darren information about investment strategies, tax optimization, ways to protect assets. The language was formal, businesslike. But gradually, over the course of weeks and then months, the tone had shifted. Professional admiration became personal compliments. Business lunches became dinner dates. Financial consulting became something much more intimate. Reading their exchanges felt like swallowing glass. Each message cut deeper than the last. Darren wrote to June with a passion and vulnerability that Judith thought had been reserved for her. He called June brilliant, exciting, everything he'd been missing. He said things that made Judith want to scream. He talked about feeling trapped in a life that had become too predictable, too safe. He described Judith as nice, comfortable, reliable. Words that sounded like compliments but were clearly meant as criticism. She was boring. She was stale. She was holding him back from the exciting life he deserved. The words cut deeper than the financial betrayal. Money could be recovered. But this, the knowledge that the man she loved had spent months thinking of her with contempt, had described her in such dismissive terms to his lover. That was a wound that would take much longer to heal. But Judith forced herself to keep reading, to document everything. She couldn't let emotion derail her now, because buried in the romantic messages were the details of their plan. Darren and June weren't just having an affair and hiding money. They were building a new life together, funded by the systematic theft of everything Judith had helped create. The emails revealed that Darren had been working with June for nearly a year. It had started legitimately enough, which was probably how Darren justified it to himself. Darren had attended a wealth management seminar where June was speaking about international tax strategies and asset protection. He'd been impressed by their presentation, had appreciated their knowledge and confidence. He'd scheduled a consultation to discuss his own financial situation. But somewhere between the professional relationship and the personal one, they'd crossed a line, and then crossed several more. Together, working as a team, they'd opened accounts in the Cayman Islands, established a shell corporation in Delaware under a name that had nothing to do with either of them, created a network of financial instruments specifically designed to hide assets from scrutiny, from her. Darren had been moving money slowly, carefully, never enough at once to raise red flags with the banks. The cash withdrawals were just the beginning. That money was converted to cryptocurrency using peer-to-peer exchanges that didn't require identification. Then the cryptocurrency was transferred offshore, where it was converted back to traditional currency and deposited into accounts that only Darren could access. It was sophisticated. It was professional. It was exactly the kind of scheme Judith investigated in her day job, and it would have worked if Darren hadn't gotten careless with his phone. The apartment in the city was leased under the Shell Corporation's name. June lived there, in that luxury building with the marble and the views, waiting for Darren to make his final move. According to the emails, that move was scheduled for January 15th, just 2 months away. Darren planned to file for divorce on January 2nd, right after the holidays. After one last Christmas with Judith's family, one last New Year's Eve kiss at midnight, he would end their marriage. He'd cite irreconcilable differences. He'd be calm and reasonable. He'd already drafted the complaint with June's help, Judith saw with horror. They'd been planning this for months. By the time the divorce proceedings revealed the missing money, the trail would be cold, and the assets would be hidden behind layers of legal protection that would take years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to penetrate. If Judith even realized the money was missing before it was too late. June had even prepared a detailed exit strategy. They'd researched divorce law in their state, identified loopholes in asset disclosure requirements, and crafted a narrative that would make Darren look like the reasonable party. He would claim that Judith had become distant and career-obsessed, that she'd prioritized work over their marriage, that they'd simply grown apart. He'd paint himself as the heartbroken husband who tried everything to save their relationship. He'd offer her the house, which seemed generous on paper, except Judith now understood that the house was mortgaged to nearly its full value. Darren had taken out a home equity line of credit 6 months ago. He'd told Judith it was for potential investment opportunities, a chance to diversify their portfolio. She'd trusted him, had signed the papers without question because that's what you did in a marriage. You trusted your partner. He'd funneled every penny of that money into his hidden accounts. By the time everything was uncovered, if it ever was, Darren and June would be living comfortably abroad, beyond the reach of easy legal recourse. They discussed Portugal, Costa Rica, places where the cost of living was low and the extradition laws were favorable. They'd be funded by the life Judith had helped build, the future she'd sacrificed for, the dreams she'd believed they shared. Judith photographed every email, every document, every piece of evidence she could find. She worked until 3 a.m, until her eyes burned and her hands cramped from holding her phone at the right angle to capture clear images. She documented everything with the same meticulous attention to detail she brought to her professional cases. Then she carefully closed the laptop, returned everything to exactly how she'd found it, and climbed back into bed next to her husband. Darren stirred slightly, reaching for her in his sleep the way he always did, and Judith had to fight the urge to recoil from his touch. She lay rigid in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, while her husband's arm draped across her waist. The man beside her was a stranger, a criminal, a calculated liar who'd spent months planning to destroy her. But he didn't know that she knew, and that gave her the only advantage she had. The next morning, Judith called in sick to work. She'd never used a sick day for anything other than actual illness in her entire career, maintaining a perfect attendance record that was a point of pride. But this qualified as an emergency. She waited until Darren left for the office, watching from the upstairs window as his car disappeared down their tree-lined street, the leaves already turning brown and falling. Then she got to work. First, she called her mentor, Pauline Honeyford, a senior partner at one of the top forensic accounting firms in the country. Pauline had been Judith's professor in graduate school, the one who'd recognized her talent for financial investigation and personally recruited her to the field. Over the years, they'd maintained a close professional relationship that had evolved into genuine friendship. They met at a quiet cafe far from both their usual neighborhoods, a little place where no one would recognize them or wonder why they were meeting. Pauline arrived first, already seated in a corner booth with 2 lattes waiting. Her silver hair was pulled back in its usual elegant chignon, and her sharp eyes studied Judith with concern as she approached. "You look terrible," Pauline said bluntly as Judith slid into the booth. "What's wrong?" Judith had planned to be calm and professional, to lay out the facts without emotion. But seeing Pauline's worried face, feeling the weight of genuine concern from someone who cared about her, broke something loose inside her chest. She told Pauline everything: the text message, the hidden accounts, the affair, the sophisticated theft scheme, the planned exit strategy. She laid out the evidence methodically, pulling up the photos and screenshots on her phone, but her voice shook and tears kept threatening to spill over. Pauline listened without interrupting, her expression growing grimmer with each revelation. She'd seen a lot in her career, dealt with complex fraud cases that involved millions of dollars and elaborate schemes. But this was personal in a way that those cases never were. When Judith finished, Pauline sat back and let out a long breath. She was quiet for a moment, processing everything, and Judith waited anxiously for her mentor's assessment. "This is sophisticated," Pauline finally said quietly. "Whoever this June person is, they know what they're doing. This isn't amateur hour. Your husband has been getting professional-grade advice on how to hide marital assets. The structured transactions, the offshore accounts, the shell corporation. This is textbook financial abuse." "Can I stop it?" Judith asked, hating how desperate she sounded. "Can I get the money back?" Pauline considered the question carefully, tapping her perfectly manicured nails against the table. "You're in a unique position," she said slowly. "You found out before he filed, before the money disappeared completely. And you have documentation. That's powerful. But you need to move carefully. If Darren realizes you know, he'll accelerate the timeline. He and June will move the money even deeper, to places where you'll never find it." "What do I do?" Judith asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "You beat them at their own game," Pauline said firmly. "You're a forensic accountant, Judith. One of the best I've trained. Use those skills. Build an airtight case. Gather every piece of evidence you can find. And get yourself a lawyer who specializes in high-conflict divorce with hidden assets. I know someone. She's expensive, but she's worth every penny. Trust me on this." Pauline pulled out her phone and sent Judith a contact card. Rebecca Torres. The name was familiar. Judith had heard of her, had read about some of her cases in the legal news. She had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting her clients from financial abuse. "Call her today," Pauline instructed. "Tell her I sent you. She'll see you immediately." Judith nodded, feeling some of the overwhelming panic start to recede. She had a plan now. She had someone on her side who understood what she was facing. "One more thing," Pauline said, reaching across the table to grip Judith's hand. "What your husband did, what's being done to you, this isn't your fault. You weren't stupid for trusting him. You weren't naive for believing in your marriage. He's the criminal here. He's the one who betrayed every vow he made. Don't let him make you feel like you did something wrong by being a good wife." Judith felt tears spill over, and this time she didn't try to stop them. "Thank you," she whispered. The lawyer's name was Rebecca Torres, and her office was exactly what Judith expected. A sleek downtown high-rise, all glass and steel and expensive modern art. The reception area had leather furniture and a view of the city that probably cost extra in rent. Everything about the space communicated success, power, and the kind of money it took to hire the best. Rebecca herself was a woman in her 50s with silver hair cut in a sharp bob, piercing dark eyes, and a handshake that conveyed both strength and reassurance. She wore a navy suit that probably cost more than Judith's car payment, and when she smiled, it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Pauline speaks very highly of you," Rebecca said as she led Judith into her office. "She said you discovered your husband is stealing from you. I want to hear everything." Judith spent the next 2 hours walking Rebecca through everything she'd found. The lawyer listened carefully, taking notes in neat handwriting, occasionally asking questions that showed she understood both the legal and financial complexities involved. After reviewing all the evidence Judith had gathered, Rebecca leaned back in her chair and smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It wasn't the kind of smile you'd give a friend. It was the smile of a predator who just spotted prey. "Your husband made a critical mistake," Rebecca said. "He underestimated you. He assumed that because you'd been a devoted wife, you'd be a passive victim. He thought you'd be too hurt, too confused, too emotional to fight back effectively. He's about to learn otherwise." "What's our strategy?" Judith asked. Rebecca pulled out a legal pad and started outlining the plan. "We build an airtight case. We document everything. We file strategically to maximize shock value and minimize his ability to respond. We hit him from multiple angles simultaneously so he can't defend one front without exposing another." "But here's the key thing," Rebecca continued, tapping her pen against the pad. "We need to wait until he's moved enough money that we can prove criminal intent. Right now, he could potentially claim this was legitimate tax planning that got complicated. We need him to commit fully to the fraud. We need him to think he's gotten away with it. Then we strike." Over the next 2 weeks, Judith and Rebecca built their case like architects constructing a building. Foundation first, then framework, then all the details that would make it airtight. They hired a private investigator, a former detective named Jack who specialized in domestic cases. He confirmed the affair, documenting Darren's regular visits to June's apartment. He followed Darren to romantic dinners, weekend getaways to bed and breakfasts in the country, long walks through parks where Darren and June held hands like any other couple in love. The photographs Jack provided were damning. Darren's hand on June's back as they entered a restaurant. Darren and June kissing in the parking lot of a hotel. Darren laughing at something June said, his face open and happy in a way that made Judith's chest ache, because she remembered when he used to look at her like that. They subpoenaed records from the Shell Corporation, filed preliminary motions to freeze assets, and prepared a legal strategy that would hit Darren and June from multiple angles simultaneously. Civil suit for fraud, criminal complaints for money laundering, emergency motions to prevent dissipation of marital assets. But Rebecca advised patience. "We're building toward a crescendo," she explained. "We need Darren to keep moving money, to keep building the evidence against himself. Every transfer he makes gives us more ammunition. Every email he sends with June planning their future gives us more proof of intent." So Judith waited, and while she waited, she played the perfect wife with an actress's skill. She smiled and laughed and made love to her husband and pretended that her heart wasn't breaking with every false word, every calculated touch. It was the hardest performance of her life, harder than any professional case she'd ever worked. During the day, she continued her regular work, investigating other people's financial crimes while secretly building a case against her own husband. Her colleagues noticed she seemed distracted, asked if everything was okay. Judith assured them she was just tired, working on a difficult case, nothing to worry about. At night, she monitored Darren's activities through the documentation she'd set up. She'd installed software on her computer that mirrored his emails to her encrypted account. Every message he sent to June, she saw. Every plan they made, she knew about. Every transfer of money, she tracked. It was torture. Watching your marriage end in real time, seeing your husband plan a future that didn't include you, knowing that the person sleeping beside you had already left you in every way that mattered. But Judith endured it because she had a goal. She would win. She would get justice. She would make sure Darren and June didn't profit from their betrayal. The week before Thanksgiving, Darren suggested they host dinner at their house. His parents were coming, along with Judith's sister Emma and her family. The kids were excited to see their aunt and uncle. Darren's mother was bringing her famous pumpkin pie. It would be nice, Darren said with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm, to have everyone together. One last family holiday before everything changes. He'd written to June in an email Judith had intercepted that same morning. Judith agreed with a smile that felt like it would crack her face. She spent the week cooking and decorating, preparing the house for guests, playing the role of gracious hostess while her marriage rotted from the inside out. She made Darren's favorite dishes, set the table with their wedding china, put out the decorations they'd collected over 12 years of holidays together. At the dinner table, surrounded by family who had no idea what was happening, Darren gave a toast. He stood up with his wine glass, smiling at everyone gathered around their dining room table, and thanked Judith for being such an amazing partner. "I'm grateful for so many things this Thanksgiving," he said, his voice warm and sincere. "But most of all, I'm grateful for Judith, for making our house a home, for being the foundation of everything good in my life, for being my partner through all these years." He looked directly at her as he spoke, his eyes soft with what looked like genuine affection. Judith's sister reached over and squeezed her hand under the table, her eyes a little misty. Darren's mother dabbed at her eyes with her napkin. Everyone raised their glasses and smiled at the beautiful couple who'd built such a strong marriage. The lies flowed so smoothly from Darren's mouth that Judith wondered if he even recognized them as lies anymore. Maybe he'd told himself this story so many times that he believed his own fiction, that Judith was boring, that he deserved more excitement, that taking what they'd built together was somehow justified because he wasn't fulfilled. Or maybe he was just that good at lying. After everyone left and they were cleaning up, Darren hugged Judith from behind while she washed dishes. His arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder, and for a moment it felt like old times. Before she knew about June, before she'd discovered the theft, when their marriage was still real, or at least when she'd believed it was. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "I'm so lucky to have you." Judith closed her eyes and let the words wash over her. She didn't believe them anymore. How could she? But she needed him to believe that she did. "I love you too," she whispered back, and felt a piece of her soul die with the lie. December arrived with early snow and holiday decorations appearing on every street. Their neighborhood transformed into a winter wonderland, lights twinkling on every house, inflatable snowmen and reindeer dotting front yards. Darren became more attentive as his planned exit date approached, as if he was trying to store up good memories or maybe assuage his guilt. He bought Judith expensive gifts, jewelry she'd admired but never expected to receive. He planned romantic dinners at nice restaurants, took her dancing like they used to do when they were dating, talked about their future together with an enthusiasm that would have been touching if Judith didn't know it was all performance. He was building his narrative, creating memories and moments he could point to later. Evidence that he'd tried to make the marriage work before it fell apart. Proof that he'd been a good husband right up until the end. Judith matched his energy, playing her part in this elaborate theater of lies. But privately, she and Rebecca were preparing for war. On December 20th, Darren made his largest transfer yet. $150,000 moved from their investment account through a series of transactions clearly designed to obscure the trail. First to a cryptocurrency exchange, then bounced through multiple digital wallets, finally landing in the Cayman account. It was bold, it was risky, and it was exactly the kind of aggressive move that Rebecca had been waiting for. "Time to move," Rebecca told Judith over the phone. "We've got everything we need, more than enough to prove criminal intent. Are you ready?" Judith thought about the question. Was she ready? Ready to blow up her marriage publicly? ready to face the scandal and the gossip and the pitying looks from people who'd thought they had the perfect relationship, ready to stand in front of a judge and detail her husband's betrayal. "Yes," she said firmly, "I'm ready." On December 21st, the winter solstice, the darkest day of the year, Judith filed for divorce. But she didn't file a standard petition requesting dissolution of marriage. Rebecca had crafted something much more comprehensive. They filed a motion for emergency relief, alleging financial fraud, dissipation of marital assets, and requesting immediate freeze of all accounts, both known and suspected. They filed criminal complaints with both local and federal authorities, alleging money laundering and tax fraud. The federal complaint detailed the structured transactions, the offshore accounts, the use of cryptocurrency to hide the money trail. And they filed a civil suit against June Morrison and Morrison Financial Consulting for conspiracy to commit fraud, intentional interference with marital assets, and professional malpractice. Rebecca had coordinated the whole operation like a military strike. The papers were served simultaneously to Darren at his office, to June at the city apartment, and to Morrison Financial Consulting's registered agent. At the exact same moment, Rebecca had worked with law enforcement to freeze the offshore accounts, catching Darren and June completely off guard before they could move the money somewhere even more hidden. Judith was in Rebecca's office when Darren called her cell phone. She watched it ring once, twice, 3 times, his smiling face from their wedding day lighting up the screen with each ring. She let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again immediately. "Answer it," Rebecca instructed. "Put it on speaker. Let's hear what he has to say." Judith took a deep breath and answered on the 4th ring. "What the hell is this?" Darren shouted, his voice cracking with panic. His usual smooth confidence was completely gone, replaced by raw fear. "Judith, what are you doing? This is insane. We can talk about this. Whatever you think is happening, you're wrong. You're making a huge mistake." Judith's voice was steady, calm, the voice of a woman who'd spent weeks preparing for this exact moment. "I'm a forensic accountant, Darren. Did you really think I wouldn't notice $80,000 missing from our savings? Or the hidden credit cards? Or the offshore accounts? Or the shell corporation in Delaware?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. Judith could hear Darren's breathing, fast and shallow. She could picture him in his office, the color draining from his face as he realized how thoroughly she'd caught him. "How long have you known?" Darren finally asked, his voice small and defeated. "Long enough," Judith said, "long enough to document everything. Every transfer, every email, every lie you told me while you planned to steal our life and give it to someone else. Every romantic dinner you expensed on the hidden credit card. Every weekend you spent with June while telling me you were at conferences." "Judith, it's not like that," Darren started, but Judith cut him off. "Yes, it is exactly like that. You didn't just cheat on me, Darren. You committed fraud. You laundered money. You conspired to hide marital assets. You structured transactions to avoid federal reporting requirements. And you did it with such arrogance that you left a trail a first-year accounting student could follow." "I want to talk," Darren said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Please, Judith, let me explain. I can fix this. We can work this out." "Explain to your lawyer," Judith replied. "I'm sure you'll need a good one. Criminal defense, probably. And Darren, one more thing." "What?" he asked quietly. "June is getting served with a separate suit. Morrison Financial Consulting is going to be investigated by the SEC. Your accomplice's business is finished. You didn't just betray me. You brought them down with you. I hope it was worth it." She hung up before he could respond. Her hand was shaking, but her heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. It was done. The secret was out. The battle had begun. Rebecca was smiling, that predatory expression Judith was getting used to. That was perfect. Cold, professional, you did great. The next few months were brutal in ways Judith hadn't fully anticipated. Darren fought back hard, hearing his own team of lawyers who tried every tactic they could think of. They attempted to discredit Judith's evidence, claiming she'd obtained it illegally by accessing Darren's email without permission. They tried to paint her as a vindictive spouse, exaggerating innocent financial planning for revenge. They suggested she was mentally unstable, pointing to the fact that she'd pretended not to know about the affair for weeks. But Judith had documentation that was airtight. She had emails explicitly discussing how to hide assets from her. She had financial records showing the structured transactions designed to avoid federal reporting requirements. She had testimony from the private investigator, photographs of Darren and June together, phone records showing hundreds of calls and texts between them. She had evidence that any forensic accountant would recognize as clear proof of fraud. Darren's lawyers tried to settle quickly, offering Judith 60% of the marital assets if she dropped the criminal complaints. It was a generous offer on paper, more than most people got in divorces, but Rebecca advised her to refuse. "He took nearly everything," Rebecca said firmly. "The savings you built together, the home equity, money that should have funded your retirement, your future. We're not settling for 60% of what's left after he spent thousands on his affair and hid hundreds of thousands offshore. We're getting everything back, plus damages, plus you're keeping your career and reputation intact while his falls apart." The criminal investigation moved forward on a parallel track. In February, the federal prosecutor's office announced indictments for Darren and June on charges of money laundering, tax fraud, and conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming. The structured transactions, the offshore accounts, the emails discussing how to hide money from authorities and from Judith. June disappeared for a while, presumably trying to protect themselves from the legal avalanche that had crashed down on their consulting business. Morrison Financial Consulting lost its business license. The SEC investigation revealed that June had done this before, helped other clients hide assets in ways that violated securities laws. What had seemed like a sophisticated operation was really just a pattern of fraud that June had perfected over years. Darren lost his job when the indictments became public. The prestigious consulting firm where he'd worked for 15 years quietly let him go, citing the company's ethics standards and the need to maintain client trust. His professional reputation, built over decades, crumbled in weeks. The colleagues who'd admired him, the clients who'd trusted him, all turned away. The divorce proceedings moved forward with Rebecca systematically dismantling every argument Darren's team presented. Every delay tactic was countered. Every motion was answered. Every attempt to hide additional assets was uncovered. In April, after months of legal battles, the court ruled. Judith sat in the courtroom listening as the judge read the decision, her sister Emma holding her hand for support. The judge was not sympathetic to a man who tried to steal from his wife with such calculated precision. She awarded Judith 90% of all marital assets, including funds recovered from the offshore accounts. Darren was ordered to pay Judith's legal fees, which had climbed into 6 figures. The house, the beautiful house they'd bought together with such hope and dreams, was awarded solely to Judith. Darren was also sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for the financial crimes, followed by 3 years of probation and 500 hours of community service. June received a similar sentence and was permanently barred from working in financial services. On a warm day in May, almost exactly 8 months after the text message that had changed everything, Judith stood in the kitchen where this had all begun. The space looked the same physically, but felt completely different emotionally. She'd repainted the walls a soft blue instead of the beige Darren had preferred, changed the curtains from the heavy drapes to light linen that let in more sun, bought new dishes to replace the wedding china that carried too many memories. She was slowly making the house hers alone, erasing the traces of the life she'd thought she had and creating something new in its place. Pauline stopped by that afternoon with a bottle of champagne, not to celebrate the divorce, she'd said on the phone, but to celebrate you. They sat in Judith's backyard, watching the late spring sunshine filter through the trees that were finally in full leaf. "You did it," Pauline said, raising her glass. "You beat them at their own game. You used your intelligence and your skills and your determination, and you won." Judith smiled, but it was bittersweet. "I won the battle. I got the money back. I proved I was smarter than both of them combined. I got justice and vindication and everything I was fighting for. But I still lost 12 years of my life to someone who was planning to throw me away like garbage. I still have to rebuild my entire life from scratch. No, Pauline said firmly, setting down her glass and leaning forward. You didn't lose those 12 years. You lived them. You loved genuinely, even if that love wasn't returned the way it should have been. You built a career, grew as a person, created memories and experiences. Those years weren't wasted just because they ended badly. And when you discovered the betrayal, Pauline continued, you didn't fall apart. You could have. Many people would have. But instead, you fought back with everything you had. You were strategic and brave and brilliant. That's not losing, Judith. That's winning. Judith considered this, watching the sunlight play across the grass. Maybe Pauline was right. Maybe she needed to reframe how she thought about what had happened. Not as 12 years lost, but as a chapter that had ended and taught her things she needed to know. She'd been betrayed in the worst way possible, but she hadn't been destroyed by it. She'd used her intelligence, her skills, and her determination to protect herself and hold her betrayers accountable. She'd turned heartbreak into strategic action. She'd proven that being a victim was a choice, and she'd chosen differently. The money was back in her accounts, earning interest and rebuilding toward the future she'd thought was secure. The house was hers, free and clear, a space she was transforming into something that felt like home again. Her career was intact and actually stronger than before. Word had spread in professional circles about how she'd uncovered and prosecuted her own husband's fraud. She'd been flooded with job offers from firms who wanted someone with her particular combination of technical skill and personal fortitude. She'd also been contacted by several women's organizations who wanted her to speak about financial abuse in marriage, to teach other women how to protect themselves. But more than the material victories, Judith had discovered something about herself. She was stronger than she'd known. She was capable of surviving devastation and coming out on the other side not just intact, but empowered. She could trust her own judgment, rely on her own intelligence, believe in her own strength. The grief was still there, of course. It lived in her chest like a stone she carried everywhere. She mourned the marriage she'd thought she had, the future she'd planned, the person she'd believed Darren to be. Some mornings she still woke up and reached for him before remembering he was gone. Some nights she still cried into her pillow, grieving not for the man he actually was, but for the man she'd loved who had never really existed. But alongside the grief was something else, a quiet strength, a knowledge that she could trust herself, could rely on her own intelligence and instincts. Darren had underestimated her catastrophically. He'd seen her devotion as weakness and her trust as stupidity. He'd been catastrophically, expensively wrong. Judith started therapy, working through the trauma of betrayal with a counselor who specialized in financial abuse within marriages. Dr. Fiona Norrell was a woman in her 40s who'd helped hundreds of people through similar situations. She helped Judith understand that what Darren had done had a name beyond simple cheating. Economic domestic violence, Dr. Norrell explained. The systematic control and theft of financial resources as a form of abuse and control. It's more common than most people realize, especially in relationships where one partner handles most of the financial decisions. Judith learned that she wasn't alone, that this happened to smart, capable, successful people all the time. That being trusting wasn't the same as being stupid. That her career as a forensic accountant didn't mean she should have somehow known what was happening in her own home. She also joined a support group for women who'd experienced similar betrayals. Meeting every other week in a community center conference room, 8 women who'd all loved and trusted and built lives with partners who'd secretly been planning to destroy everything. Listening to their stories, sharing her own, Judith found a community of survivors who understood in a way that well-meaning friends never quite could. They'd all gone through the same progression of shock, denial, grief, anger, and eventually acceptance. They'd all had to rebuild their sense of self from the ground up. One evening in July, Judith was having dinner with her sister Emma at a new restaurant downtown. They'd finished their entrees and were lingering over wine and dessert when Emma asked the question that everyone had been dancing around for months. Do you think you'll ever trust anyone again? Emma asked gently, twirling her wine glass. Will you be able to let someone in after this? To be vulnerable again? Judith thought about it for a long moment, swirling the deep red wine in her glass and watching the light catch in it. Honestly, I don't know, she finally said. Right now, the idea of being that vulnerable again terrifies me. Darren knew everything about me. I gave him access to every part of my life. My finances, my heart, my dreams, my fears. And he weaponized all of it against me. He used my trust as a tool to steal from me. But, Emma prompted, knowing her sister well enough to know there was more. But, Judith continued slowly. I also know that what Darren did says everything about him and nothing about me. I wasn't stupid for trusting him. I wasn't naive for believing in our marriage. I was normal. I was healthy. Trust is what you're supposed to have in a partnership. The problem wasn't that I trusted too much. The problem was that he was unworthy of that trust. Emma reached across the table and squeezed Judith's hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You're going to be okay, she said fiercely. Better than okay. You're going to be extraordinary, you already are. Judith smiled, feeling the truth of those words settle into her bones. I already am, she agreed. As summer turned to fall, Judith made decisions about her future that felt like reclaiming her life. She accepted a position at Paulin's firm, stepping into a senior role that came with significant autonomy and the chance to work on high-profile cases. The work was challenging and meaningful, using her skills to help others who'd been victimized by financial fraud. She sold the house in October, deciding that while she'd won the battle to keep it, she didn't want to live in the space that held so many complicated memories. Every room had a ghost. The kitchen where she'd discovered the truth. The bedroom where she'd lain awake next to her lying husband. The office where she'd found the evidence that would destroy her marriage and save her future. She bought a smaller condo downtown instead, in a modern building with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city lights. It was completely different from the suburban house she'd shared with Darren. Contemporary instead of traditional, minimal instead of cluttered with 12 years of accumulated possessions. It was a space that belonged only to her, with no memories attached. She started painting again, a hobby she'd abandoned years ago when life got busy and Darren had complained about the smell of the oils. She set up an easel by her windows and painted cityscapes, abstract swirls of color, anything that caught her creative impulse. She traveled to Iceland in November, something she'd always wanted to do but Darren had never been interested in. Too cold, he'd always said. Too remote. Not enough good restaurants. So she'd put it on her someday list and never quite made it there. Now she went alone, spending a week exploring glaciers and waterfalls and geothermal pools. She stood in front of massive waterfalls feeling the spray on her face. She watched geysers erupt with perfect timing. She stayed up late to see the northern lights dance across the sky in ribbons of green and purple. She felt small and infinite all at once, part of something much larger than her own pain. And slowly, carefully, she started to rebuild her sense of self that existed independent of being someone's wife. One afternoon in October, Judith received an unexpected letter. It arrived at her new condo, forwarded through Rebecca with a note that Judith was under no obligation to read it if she chose not to. The return address showed it had come from the Federal Correctional Facility where Darren was serving his sentence. Judith stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Part of her wanted to throw it away unopened. What could Darren possibly have to say that she needed to hear? But another part of her, the part that had always sought understanding and closure, needed to know. The letter was handwritten, several pages long on prison stationery. Darren's familiar script felt like a ghost reaching out from the past, his neat handwriting unchanged despite everything that had happened. He apologized, though Judith noted that the apologies were vague and self-serving. He claimed he'd been confused, going through some kind of midlife crisis, swept up in the excitement of something new without fully understanding what he was destroying. He said he'd never meant to hurt her, that he'd convinced himself she wouldn't really care since their marriage had grown stale. That in his mind, he'd built a narrative where she was better off without him anyway. The letter was full of justifications and excuses, painting Darren as a victim of his own poor choices rather than the architect of a calculated betrayal. He asked if Judith thought they could ever talk, if there was any chance of forgiveness, if she understood that he'd been suffering too. That loving two people had torn him apart, that the guilt had been eating at him. Judith read the entire letter twice, searching for any hint of genuine remorse or understanding of what he'd actually done. She found none, just self-pity and rationalization. She thought about writing a long response detailing everything he'd put her through, explaining why his excuses were hollow and his apologies meaningless. But in the end, she decided he didn't deserve that much of her time or energy. She wrote a single-sentence reply, folded it into an envelope, and sent it through Rebecca to be forwarded to the prison. The sentence read, "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, but you won't find it with me." She didn't hear from Darren again. As the anniversary of that terrible November morning approached, Judith found herself reflecting on how much had changed in a single year. She'd gone from blissful ignorance to devastating knowledge, to strategic action, to hard-won victory. She'd survived something she never imagined she'd have to face, and she'd come through it with her integrity intact and her future still bright with possibility. The money was important. Justice had been important. But what mattered most was what Judith had learned about herself. She was not someone who could be discarded or destroyed. She was someone who fought back with intelligence and determination. She was someone who could be betrayed by the person she loved most and still choose to believe in love itself, even if she wasn't ready to risk it again just yet. On that cold November morning a year after everything had started to fall apart, Judith woke up in her new condo, made coffee in her new kitchen, and looked out at the city stretching before her. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded her of the northern lights she'd seen in Iceland. She thought about Darren occasionally, wondered if prison had given him time to genuinely reflect on what he'd done, or if he was still telling himself comfortable lies. She thought about June, too, about how they'd helped destroy multiple lives in pursuit of money and excitement, and the thrill of getting away with something. But mostly, she thought about herself, about the woman who'd stood in that other kitchen holding a phone that wasn't hers, reading words that would change everything. That woman had been terrified and heartbroken, but she'd also been strong enough to hide that fear, smart enough to gather evidence, and brave enough to fight back. Judith was proud of that woman, proud of herself. Her phone buzzed with a text from Paulin. "Lunch today? I have a case you'll love. High-profile embezzlement. Client thinks her business partner has been stealing for years. She needs someone who understands both the technical side and the emotional toll." Judith smiled and typed back, "Absolutely. Send me the details." Because this was her life now. Using her skills to help people who'd been betrayed, who'd been stolen from, who needed someone in their corner who understood both the technical complexity of financial fraud and the emotional devastation it caused. She was good at this work, and it mattered. She was making a difference. That afternoon, meeting with her new client in a conference room at Paulin's firm, Judith recognized the look in the woman's eyes. The confusion, the hurt, the desperate need to understand how someone she'd trusted could do this. The woman's hands shook as she tried to explain the discrepancies she'd found in their company accounts. Judith reached across the table and took the woman's hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "I know this feels impossible right now," Judith said gently, "like the ground has disappeared beneath you, like you can't trust your own judgment anymore because how did you not see this coming? But I promise you we're going to figure this out. We're going to find where the money went and we're going to get it back. And you're going to survive this. You're going to be stronger than you ever imagined." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "How do you know?" Judith smiled, and this time it reached all the way to her eyes, "Because I've been exactly where you are. I've stood in that dark place where betrayal lives, and I'm still standing, stronger than before." As she left the meeting that evening, walking through the city streets in the crisp autumn air, Judith felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the false peace of ignorance, not the fragile peace of denial, but the hard-won peace that comes from facing the worst and surviving it. Darren had tried to steal her money, her future, her sense of self. He'd tried to make her a victim of his selfish choices and careful deceptions, but he'd underestimated her in every possible way. He'd forgotten or never really known that beneath the gentle wife was a brilliant mind, a fierce heart, and an iron will. Judith had won, not just the legal battle or the financial settlement, but something far more important. She'd won her freedom, her autonomy, her faith in her own strength. She discovered that being betrayed didn't make her broken, fighting back didn't make her bitter, and surviving didn't mean simply enduring. Surviving meant building something new from the ashes of what was destroyed. It meant taking the lessons learned in heartbreak and using them to protect others. It meant understanding that love and trust were still worth the risk, even when they'd been weaponized against you. As winter approached again, bringing with it the holidays that had been so painful the year before, Judith found herself looking forward instead of back. She made plans with friends, real friends who'd supported her through the divorce. She booked a trip to visit Emma's family for Christmas, looking forward to spending time with her nieces and nephews. She signed up for a pottery class at the community center just because it sounded interesting, and she'd always wanted to try it. The future she'd thought she would have, the one with Darren and shared dreams and comfortable predictability, was gone. But in its place was something she'd built entirely on her own terms. A future that belonged only to her, shaped by her choices, protected by her wisdom, and filled with possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. On New Year's Eve, Judith stood on her balcony 20 floors above the city watching fireworks explode over the skyline. Around her, in other apartments and on other balconies, people were celebrating, counting down, kissing their partners and toasting to fresh starts. She could hear the distant roar of crowds gathering in the squares downtown. Judith raised her glass to the night sky, to the year that had broken her and rebuilt her, to the strength she'd discovered in herself. To surviving, she whispered to the cold winter air. To winning, to becoming extraordinary. The fireworks lit up the darkness, brilliant and temporary and beautiful. And Judith smiled, knowing that she was all of those things too. The darkness of betrayal had tried to consume her, but she'd found her own light. Brilliant in her intelligence, temporary in her pain, and beautiful in her resilience. Darren had tried to write her story as a tragedy, with himself as the protagonist and Judith as the discarded minor character. But Judith had taken the pen back. She'd rewritten the narrative with herself at the center, not as a victim, but as a warrior, not as someone who'd been destroyed, but as someone who'd rebuilt herself into something stronger than before. And as the new year began, as the last of the fireworks faded, and the city settled into the quiet of a fresh start, Judith knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, she could handle it. She'd faced the worst betrayal imaginable, and not only survived but thrived. She'd proven to herself, and everyone who doubted that intelligence, determination, and courage could overcome even the most calculated deception. The silent heist had failed. The money was returned, the criminals punished, and Judith was free. Free from the marriage that had become a lie, free from the fear of financial ruin, and most importantly, free from the belief that being betrayed meant being defeated. She was Judith Gilliard, forensic accountant, survivor, warrior, and she was just beginning to discover everything she was capable of becoming. The whisper that changed her life hadn't come from anyone else. It had come from within, from her own strength and intelligence and refusal to be made small by someone else's cruelty. And that whisper had grown into a roar, powerful enough to shake down empires of deception and strong enough to carry her forward into a future she was proud to claim. This was her story, her victory, her life. And it was absolutely extraordinary.